For much of human prehistory, the landscape of northern Africa looked dramatically different from the vast deserts seen today. Thousands of years before the rise of the Pharaohs, regions that are now dominated by sand dunes and barren plateaus supported lakes, grasslands, and abundant wildlife. Archaeological discoveries across the Sahara reveal traces of a once fertile environment where early human communities hunted, fished, and herded animals across a landscape rich in vegetation. Rock art panels discovered in places such as the Tassili Eniger depict cattle, antelope, and even aquatic animals, indicating that these now arid regions once contained rivers and permanent water sources. This wetter phase of North African history is known to climatologists as the African Humid Period. Beginning roughly around 10,000 BCE, changes in Earth's orbital cycles altered the strength of monsoon systems affecting the continent. Increased summer solar radiation intensified monsoon rainfall over northern Africa, allowing vegetation to spread across areas that had previously been semi-arid. Geological evidence from lake sediments and fossil pollen indicates that grasslands expanded deep into what is now the Sahara Desert. Human populations took advantage of these conditions, establishing settlements near lakes and seasonal rivers across a broad expanse of the region. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous prehistoric habitation sites that confirm the widespread human presence during this period. Excavations in central Saharan regions have revealed stone tools, pottery fragments, and animal bones associated with early pastoral communities. These finds indicate that groups living in the region practiced a mixed subsistence economy, combining hunting, fishing, and the herding of domesticated cattle. In some areas, large cemeteries dating to the 6th millennium BCE demonstrate that communities had become sufficiently stable to develop long-term burial traditions. However, this relatively stable climatic phase did not last indefinitely. Beginning around the 7th millennium BCE, gradual changes in Earth's orbital patterns began weakening the North African monsoon. As rainfall decreased, lakes and rivers across the Sahara slowly began to shrink. Sediment cores taken from ancient lake beds show a progressive decline in water levels during this period. Over several centuries, grasslands that had once supported large animal populations gradually gave way to expanding desert conditions. This environmental transformation did not occur suddenly but unfolded over many generations. As water sources became less reliable, pastoral groups were forced to adjust their seasonal movements. Archaeological surveys suggest that settlements in the Central Sahara became increasingly abandoned between approximately 6,500 and 5,000 BCE. Rock art from later phases of Saharan occupation depicts scenes of migration and changing animal populations, reflecting the ecological pressures faced by these communities. As the climate continued to dry, many populations gradually moved toward regions where permanent water remained available. One of the most significant of these refuges was the valley of the Nile River. Flowing northward from equatorial Africa and the Ethiopian highlands, the Nile maintained a consistent water supply even as surrounding regions became more arid. Annual floods carried sediment downstream and deposited fertile silt across the river's narrow floodplain. Geological studies indicate that this process created a ribbon of highly productive agricultural land extending through otherwise inhospitable desert terrain. Evidence for the increasing importance of the Nile during this period appears in both archaeological and environmental records. Sediment layers along the Nile Valley contain pollen from cultivated plants and grasses associated with early agricultural activity. At the same time, surveys of Saharan archaeological sites show declining occupation levels as communities relocated toward the river corridor. This pattern suggests that environmental change played a significant role in concentrating human populations within the Nile Valley. The migration of populations toward the Nile did not immediately produce large centralized societies. Instead, small communities gradually began establishing settlements along the riverbanks where fishing, hunting, and early agriculture could support stable populations. These communities adapted their subsistence strategies to the annual flood cycle, planting crops in the nutrient-rich soils left behind when floodwaters receded. Over time, the Nile Valley became one of the most stable ecological zones in northeastern Africa. The combination of predictable flooding, fertile soil, and accessible water created conditions that were highly favorable for sustained human settlement. Archaeologists studying early Nile Valley communities emphasize that this environmental reliability allowed populations to grow and remain concentrated within a relatively narrow geographic corridor. Records from geological and archaeological research indicate that by the 6th millennium BCE, the process of population concentration along the Nile was well underway. As formerly dispersed groups moved into the valley, interactions among communities increased. Trade, migration, and the exchange of cultural practices began linking settlements across long stretches of the river. These developments would gradually transform the Nile Valley from a refuge of scattered farming communities into a region capable of supporting increasingly complex societies. As populations continued to concentrate along the Nile, new settlement patterns began to emerge across the river's fertile floodplain. Before we continue deeper into the history, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss the daily Nightfall history videos. If you enjoy exploring the ancient world and long-form historical documentaries, let us know in the comments and share which part of the story interests you the most. Unlike the increasingly arid lands beyond its banks, the Nile offered a dependable cycle of water and fertility. In a region where rainfall was limited and increasingly unpredictable, the river functioned as a stable environmental corridor stretching more than 6,000 kilometers from Central Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. Flowing northward through the eastern Sahara, the Nile connected diverse ecological zones and carried water from distant highlands into the heart of northeastern Africa. This unique geographic system would become the environmental foundation upon which later Egyptian civilization developed. The Nile is formed by the convergence of two major tributaries: the White Nile, originating in the lake regions of equatorial East Africa, and the Blue Nile, which rises in the Ethiopian highlands. Each of these rivers contributed different elements to the Nile's hydrological system. The White Nile provided a relatively steady flow of water throughout the year, while the Blue Nile delivered seasonal floodwaters generated by heavy summer rainfall in Ethiopia. When these floodwaters reached Egypt, they spread across the valley floor, depositing layers of mineral-rich silt that renewed the fertility of the soil. Geological studies of sediment deposits along the Nile confirm that these annual floods played a crucial role in shaping the agricultural landscape of ancient Egypt. The inundation typically occurred between July and October, when rising waters overflowed the riverbanks and covered the surrounding floodplain. As the waters receded, they left behind a layer of dark alluvial soil composed of fine particles transported from the Ethiopian plateau. This sediment contained nutrients essential for plant growth, allowing crops to be cultivated without the need for artificial fertilizers. Archaeobotanical research has provided important evidence for how early inhabitants of the Nile Valley adapted to these environmental conditions. Excavations at early Neolithic sites such as Fayum Oasis have uncovered charred grains of domesticated emmer wheat and barley. These findings indicate that agricultural communities were already cultivating crops along the Nile by the 6th millennium BCE. Storage pits discovered at these sites suggest that farmers harvested surplus grain and preserved it for later use, demonstrating an increasing degree of planning and resource management. Livestock domestication also formed a significant component of the Nile Valley economy. Animal bones recovered from archaeological sites indicate the presence of domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats. These animals provided meat, milk, hides, and labor for agricultural activities. Records from faunal remains show that fishing remained an important food source as well. The Nile's waters supported a wide variety of fish species, while its marshlands contained birds, reptiles, and other animals that could be hunted by local communities. The river environment also supported a diverse range of plant resources. Papyrus plants grew extensively along the Nile's marshy edges, providing raw materials for rope, mats, baskets, and eventually writing surfaces. Reeds and grasses could be used for building simple shelters or constructing small boats. Archaeologists have identified impressions of plant fibers and reed structures at early settlement sites, suggesting that communities relied heavily on these natural materials in daily life. Beyond its role in agriculture and resource gathering, the Nile also functioned as a transportation corridor linking settlements across long distances. The river's northward current and the predictable seasonal winds blowing southward created ideal conditions for travel by boat. Even simple vessels constructed from bundled reeds or wooden planks could move efficiently along the river in either direction. This ability to travel between distant communities encouraged the exchange of goods, technologies, and cultural practices. Archaeologists studying the distribution of pottery styles and stone tools along the Nile Valley have observed striking similarities between sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. These patterns suggest that early communities maintained regular contact with one another through river travel. Trade networks likely developed gradually as settlements exchanged surplus food, crafted objects, and valuable materials such as stone or minerals. The agricultural reliability of the Nile Valley distinguished it sharply from surrounding desert environments. While populations living in the Sahara faced increasing pressure as water sources disappeared, the Nile continued to provide stable conditions for cultivation and settlement. This environmental stability allowed communities to remain in one location for extended periods, leading to population growth and the gradual expansion of villages along the riverbanks. Archaeologists emphasize that the Nile's predictable flood cycle played a decisive role in shaping the social development of early Egyptian communities. The regular rhythm of inundation and planting created a natural agricultural calendar that structured economic activity throughout the year. Communities could anticipate when to sow crops, when to harvest, and when to store surplus food. Over time, this dependable system encouraged the development of more complex forms of cooperation among farmers who relied on shared access to fertile land and water resources. Evidence from early settlement sites indicates that these farming communities began to establish permanent dwellings along elevated areas near the floodplain. Such locations allowed inhabitants to remain close to agricultural fields while avoiding the highest floodwaters. Excavations reveal the remains of mudbrick structures, storage facilities, and hearths that indicate increasingly stable patterns of habitation. As environmental stability encouraged the growth of agricultural communities, the Nile Valley gradually became one of the most densely inhabited regions of northeastern Africa. Small settlements spread along the riverbanks, forming networks of villages connected by trade, travel, and shared cultural traditions. These early farming societies laid the demographic and economic foundations upon which more complex social structures would eventually develop. With environmental stability established, the earliest farming communities began to appear along the Nile's fertile floodplain. Long before the construction of pyramids or temples, small farming cultures were already experimenting with permanent life along the Nile Delta. During the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, communities living in northern Egypt began establishing settlements that reflected a growing commitment to agriculture, storage, and long-term habitation. Archaeological discoveries from this period provide some of the earliest evidence for organized village life in the Nile Valley. One of the most important early cultural regions developed around the Fayum Depression. This large basin lies west of the Nile River and contains the ancient lake known today as Lake Karen. In prehistoric times, fluctuating water levels and nearby wetlands created an environment rich in natural resources. Fish, waterfowl, and plant life were abundant, while the surrounding land offered opportunities for early cultivation. Excavations conducted throughout the Fayum region have revealed a number of Neolithic settlements dating to approximately 5200 to 4500 BCE. These sites contain large storage pits dug into the ground, many of which still hold traces of preserved grains. Archaeobotanical analysis has identified domesticated crops such as emmer wheat and barley within these pits, suggesting that farming had become a central element of the local economy. The presence of grain storage facilities indicates that inhabitants were not merely cultivating crops for immediate consumption but were producing surpluses for future use. This practice reflects an important shift toward long-term planning and food security. By storing harvests, communities could survive periods when agricultural production was limited, such as during droughts or unusually poor flood cycles. In addition to farming, fishing played a major role in the subsistence strategies of Fayum communities. Archaeologists have discovered bone harpoons, fish hooks, and woven nets among the artifacts recovered from settlement sites. These tools demonstrate that inhabitants exploited the aquatic resources of nearby lakes and wetlands extensively. Remains of fish species recovered from excavation layers confirm that fishing was a consistent and reliable food source. Animal domestication also formed part of the economic foundation of these early societies. Excavated animal bones indicate the presence of domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats. These animals likely provided meat, milk, and hides, as well as a form of portable wealth that could be moved or traded between communities. Evidence suggests that livestock herding existed alongside farming rather than replacing it, producing a mixed agricultural economy. While the Fayum region provides important evidence for early agricultural adaptation, another significant Neolithic culture developed within the Nile Delta itself. This society is represented by the archaeological site of Merimd Beni Salama. Located on the edge of the Delta floodplain, Merimd offers valuable insight into the development of village life during the same general period. Excavations at Merimd have uncovered the remains of houses constructed from mud and reed materials. These structures were typically circular or oval in shape and built close together, forming clusters that may represent extended family groups or small community neighborhoods. The simplicity of these dwellings suggests that construction techniques were still relatively basic, relying primarily on locally available materials. One of the most distinctive features of the Merimd culture is its pottery. Archaeologists have recovered numerous ceramic vessels that display early experimentation with shape and decoration. Many of these pots were handmade rather than produced on a wheel, and their surfaces often feature simple patterns or burnished finishes. The presence of pottery indicates that residents had developed methods for cooking, storing food, and transporting liquids. Tools discovered at the site also reveal aspects of daily life in this early community. Stone blades, grinding stones, and bone implements were commonly used for food preparation and craft production. Grinding stones in particular demonstrate that cereal grains formed an important part of the diet. By grinding harvested wheat or barley into flour, inhabitants could prepare bread or porridge as staple foods. Burial practices at Merimd provide additional clues about social organization. Graves discovered near residential areas contain individuals buried in simple pits with minimal accompanying objects. Unlike later Egyptian societies, which developed elaborate tomb architecture and rich funerary goods, Merimd burials appear relatively modest. This pattern suggests that social differences between individuals were limited and that wealth or status distinctions were not strongly emphasized. Because of the absence of monumental structures or elite burial goods, many archaeologists interpret the Merimd culture as relatively egalitarian. Leadership may have existed in the form of respected elders or skilled individuals, but there is little evidence for rigid social hierarchies or centralized authority. Communities likely operated through cooperative relationships centered on farming, resource sharing, and mutual defense. Despite their relatively simple organization, these early settlements demonstrate important cultural developments. Pottery styles from Merimd show gradual changes over time, indicating that artisans were experimenting with techniques and passing knowledge between generations. Similarly, agricultural practices appear to have become increasingly refined as farmers gained experience working with Nile flood cycles and seasonal planting schedules. Connections between northern Egyptian communities and neighboring regions are also evident in the archaeological record. Stone materials used for tools at Merimd often originated from distant sources, implying the existence of exchange networks. Ornaments made from shells or other non-local materials suggest that trade or travel linked these settlements with broader populations across northeastern Africa. These early interactions helped transmit ideas, technologies, and cultural traditions between different communities along the Nile. Over time, such exchanges contributed to the gradual emergence of regional cultural identities, each with its own distinctive pottery styles, burial customs, and economic strategies. The societies of the Fayum and Merimd regions represent some of the earliest known agricultural cultures in northern Egypt. Their settlements demonstrate that communities had already begun adapting successfully to the Nile environment thousands of years before the rise of pharaonic civilization. Through farming, fishing, animal husbandry, and craft production, these populations laid the groundwork for more complex social developments that would appear in later periods. While northern communities developed their own traditions, new cultural centers were simultaneously emerging farther south. By the late 5th millennium BCE, communities in Upper Egypt were producing some of the most sophisticated pottery yet seen in the Nile Valley. These societies, known collectively as the Badarian culture, represent an important stage in the development of prehistoric Egypt. Emerging around 4400 BCE and lasting until roughly 4000 BCE, The Badarian period illustrates how agricultural villages in Upper Egypt began to adopt more complex technologies, expand trade networks, and develop clearer social distinctions. The Badarian culture is named after the region surrounding the modern town of El Badari. Located along the eastern bank of the Nile, this area contains a series of archaeological sites that have produced valuable evidence about early Egyptian communities. Excavations conducted in the early 20th century revealed settlements, cemeteries, and numerous artifacts that collectively define what archaeologists now call the Badarian cultural tradition. Unlike earlier Neolithic communities of northern Egypt, which often relied on simple tools and undecorated pottery, Badarian artisans demonstrated a remarkable level of craftsmanship. Among the most famous artifacts from this period are finely made ceramic vessels with thin walls and highly polished surfaces. Many of these pots feature a distinctive red body with a blackened rim, a style created by carefully controlling the firing process during pottery production. These ceramics were not only functional household items, but also objects of aesthetic value. Their smooth surfaces and elegant shapes suggest that Badarian potters possessed a sophisticated understanding of clay preparation and kiln conditions. Archaeologists believe that such pottery required specialized knowledge and skill, indicating that certain individuals within the community may have focused primarily on craft production. In addition to pottery, Badarian sites have yielded a wide range of stone tools and decorative objects. Flint blades discovered in burial contexts show careful shaping and sharp cutting edges, suitable for activities such as hunting, food preparation, and craft work. Grinding stones and sickle blades indicate that agriculture remained the economic foundation of Badarian life. Personal ornaments discovered in graves reveal another dimension of Badarian craftsmanship. Archaeologists have uncovered beads and jewelry made from materials such as ivory, bone, and semi-precious stones. These objects often required careful carving and polishing, demonstrating the growing importance of artistic expression and personal adornment in Badarian society. Perhaps even more significant is the discovery of early copper objects at Badarian sites. Small tools and decorative pieces made from copper suggest that metalworking was beginning to appear in the Nile Valley during this period. Although copper use was still limited compared with later eras, its presence indicates technological experimentation and expanding access to new materials. Burial practices provide some of the clearest evidence for social change during the Badarian period. Archaeological excavations have uncovered numerous cemeteries containing individual graves, each carefully prepared and arranged. The deceased were typically placed in shallow pits, often positioned on their sides in a flexed posture and accompanied by a variety of goods. Some graves contain relatively modest items, such as simple pottery vessels or basic tools. Others, however, include elaborate ceramics, jewelry, and finely crafted objects. This variation in grave goods suggests that individuals within Badarian communities did not all hold the same social status. The presence of richer burials implies that certain members of society possessed greater wealth, prestige, or influence than others. These emerging differences in burial treatment are significant because they represent one of the earliest signs of social differentiation in the Nile Valley. While earlier Neolithic societies such as those at Merimd Beni Salama appear relatively egalitarian, Badarian communities may have begun developing more defined social roles and hierarchies. Another notable feature of the Badarian culture is evidence for long-distance trade. Archaeologists studying grave goods have identified materials that could not have originated locally. Certain types of stone, shells, and decorative minerals appear to have been transported from distant regions. This suggests that Badarian communities were connected to broader exchange networks extending beyond Upper Egypt. Some of these materials may have come from the deserts east of the Nile, where mineral resources were available in rocky outcrops and wadis. Others may have arrived through contacts with populations living farther south along the Nile in the region known as Nubia. Trade with these neighboring regions would have allowed Badarian communities to obtain valuable materials that enhanced the status of individuals who possessed them. Agricultural expansion also played an important role in the development of the Badarian culture. Evidence from plant remains and farming tools suggests that cereal cultivation continued to increase during this period. Emmer wheat and barley were likely the primary crops grown along the Nile's fertile floodplain. Livestock such as cattle, sheep, and goats supplemented agricultural production and provided additional food resources. As farming techniques improved and harvests became more reliable, populations in Upper Egypt were able to grow steadily. Villages expanded and became more permanent, with communities maintaining consistent occupation of the same locations over generations. The stability of these settlements encouraged the development of craft specialization, trade networks, and more complex social relationships. Archaeologists often view the Badarian culture as a crucial turning point in prehistoric Egypt. Earlier Neolithic societies had already established agriculture and village life, but the Badarian period introduced new levels of technological skill, artistic expression, and social organization. The emergence of finely crafted pottery, early metal use, and differentiated burials suggests that communities were beginning to move beyond simple village economies toward more structured societies. These developments laid the groundwork for the cultural transformations that would soon follow. In the centuries after the Badarian period ended, new traditions would emerge in Upper Egypt that expanded on these innovations and introduced even greater complexity into the social and political landscape of the Nile Valley. Following the Badarian period, new cultural traditions would expand these developments even further. By the early 4th millennium BCE, cultural innovations in Upper Egypt were beginning to reshape social life along the Nile. Communities that had once functioned primarily as small farming villages were gradually transforming into more complex societies with expanding trade networks, skilled craft production, and clearer social hierarchies. Archaeologists refer to this important stage in Egyptian prehistory as the Naqada I period, also known as the Amratian culture. Emerging around 4000 BCE, this cultural phase represents a major step in the long process that would eventually lead to the formation of the Egyptian state. The name Naqada comes from the archaeological site of Naqada, located along the west bank of the Nile. Excavations in this region have uncovered extensive cemeteries and settlement remains that reveal a distinctive set of cultural practices. Similar artifacts and burial traditions have also been discovered at other important sites, including Hierakonpolis and Abydos. Together, these locations demonstrate that the Naqada cultural tradition spread across a large portion of Upper Egypt. One of the most visible indicators of this cultural transformation is pottery. Ceramic vessels from the Naqada I period show clear advances in both craftsmanship and artistic design. Among the most recognizable examples are black-topped pottery vessels, which feature darkened rims contrasting with polished red bodies. This distinctive appearance was achieved through careful control of the firing process during production. Potters likely placed the rim of the vessel in a reducing atmosphere while allowing the rest of the pot to oxidize, creating the characteristic two-tone effect. These ceramics were not only aesthetically striking but also technically sophisticated. The thin walls and smooth surfaces of many Naqada I vessels demonstrate that potters had refined their methods of shaping and firing clay. Archaeologists believe that such pottery may have served both everyday household functions and ceremonial purposes, particularly when placed in graves as burial offerings. Agriculture remained the foundation of life during the Naqada I period. Communities along the Nile continued to cultivate staple crops such as emmer wheat and barley. Farmers took advantage of the river's predictable flood cycle, planting seeds after the annual inundation had receded and harvesting crops before the next flooding season. Grinding stones and sickle blades discovered at Naqada sites indicate that cereal processing formed an essential part of daily life. Animal husbandry also played an important role in the local economy. Archaeological evidence shows that cattle, sheep, and goats were widely kept by Naqada communities. These animals provided meat, milk, and hides, while cattle in particular may have held symbolic or social significance. Some burial sites include cattle remains, suggesting that livestock ownership could represent wealth or status within the community. Although agriculture and livestock were central to survival, the Nile environment continued to offer additional resources. Fishing in the river and nearby marshlands provided a steady source of protein. Bone harpoons, fishhooks, and net weights discovered at settlement sites indicate that fishing techniques were well developed. Hunting of birds and small animals along the floodplain further supplemented the diet. Alongside these economic activities, Naqada I communities began to display signs of increasing craft specialization. Stone workers produced finely shaped tools and vessels, while artisans carved decorative objects from materials such as bone and ivory. Beads made from shells, stones, and other materials were used as ornaments, reflecting both aesthetic preferences and social identity. Burial practices from the Naqada I period provide important insight into changing social structures. Cemeteries associated with Naqada settlements contain hundreds of individual graves, each with varying numbers and types of burial goods. Many graves include simple pottery vessels and basic tools, suggesting modest social standing. Others, however, contain more elaborate objects, such as stone vessels, finely decorated ceramics, and ornamental jewelry. The uneven distribution of these goods suggests that social differences were beginning to emerge within Naqada communities. Certain individuals or families appear to have possessed greater access to valuable materials and skilled craftsmanship. While these distinctions were not yet as pronounced as in later Egyptian society, they represent an early stage in the development of social hierarchy. Some archaeologists interpret these richer graves as belonging to individuals who held leadership roles within their communities. Such leaders may have coordinated agricultural activities, managed trade relationships, or organized communal projects. Their status would have been reinforced through burial ceremonies that displayed wealth and prestige. Trade and interaction between settlements also intensified during the Naqada I period. Artifacts discovered at archaeological sites indicate that materials were being transported across considerable distances. Certain types of stone used for tools and vessels originated from regions outside the immediate Nile Valley, implying the existence of exchange networks connecting different communities. These interactions helped spread cultural innovations across Upper Egypt. Pottery styles, burial customs, and artistic motifs appear in similar forms at multiple sites, suggesting that people were sharing ideas and technologies through regular contact. River travel along the Nile likely facilitated these exchanges, allowing goods and information to move efficiently between settlements. The growth of these cultural connections gradually produced what archaeologists describe as a cultural horizon. In this context, the term refers to a set of shared practices and material styles that spread across a broad geographic region. The Naqada I culture represents one of the earliest such horizons in Egyptian prehistory, linking numerous communities through common traditions. Over time, these developments contributed to the formation of larger and more organized societies. As settlements expanded and interaction increased, competition for resources and prestige may also have intensified. Communities that controlled valuable trade routes or fertile land would have gained advantages over their neighbors, potentially laying the groundwork for emerging centers of power. The Naqada I period therefore represents a crucial transitional stage in the history of the Nile Valley. Earlier cultures such as the Badarian had already introduced important technological and social innovations, but the Naqada phase expanded these changes across a wider region. Craft production became more refined, social differences more visible, and connections between communities more extensive. As these cultural innovations spread, regional interaction between settlements intensified. Increasing access to rare materials signaled the emergence of economic networks extending beyond the Nile Valley. During the Naqada I period, communities in Upper Egypt began developing more sophisticated systems of craft production and exchange. Archaeological discoveries from settlements and cemeteries reveal that artisans were producing a wider variety of specialized goods, while traders were establishing connections with regions far beyond their immediate environment. These developments not only transformed the economic life of early Egyptian societies, but also contributed to the emergence of social hierarchies and local leadership. Craft specialization became increasingly visible in the archaeological record during this period. Earlier Neolithic communities had already produced pottery, stone tools, and simple ornaments, but Naqada I artisans expanded these traditions considerably. Skilled workers began producing finely shaped stone vessels made from materials such as basalt, limestone, and diorite. These vessels required careful carving and polishing, often taking many hours of labor to complete. Their smooth surfaces and symmetrical shapes suggest that they were valued objects, possibly used in ceremonial contexts or as prestige goods. Pottery production also continued to advance. While black-topped ceramics remained a hallmark of the Naqada I culture, potters began experimenting with additional forms and decorative techniques. Some vessels featured painted designs depicting geometric patterns, animals, or boats traveling along the Nile. These images provide rare glimpses into the symbolic world of Predynastic Egypt, suggesting that artistic expression was becoming increasingly important in community identity and ritual life. Ivory carving represents another area of craft development during the Naqada I period. Artisans used elephant ivory, hippopotamus teeth, and bone to produce a variety of small decorative objects. These included combs, pins, figurines, and ornamental handles for tools or weapons. Many of these items display carefully incised patterns or stylized animal motifs, demonstrating both technical skill and aesthetic creativity. Metalworking also began to appear more frequently in archaeological contexts. Although copper objects were still relatively rare compared with stone tools, their presence indicates that early metallurgical knowledge was spreading within Upper Egyptian communities. Small copper blades, needles, and decorative items have been discovered in several Naqada I graves. Producing such objects required access to raw copper and the ability to heat and shape the metal, suggesting that specialized knowledge of metalworking techniques was beginning to develop. Because copper ore does not occur naturally in most parts of the Nile Valley, its presence implies connections with regions where such resources were available. Archaeologists believe that early copper may have been obtained from mineral deposits in the deserts east of the Nile, including areas near the Red Sea. These desert regions contained valuable mineral resources that could be mined or gathered by groups familiar with the terrain. Evidence for long-distance trade during the Naqada I period is found in many burial sites. Some graves contain materials that clearly originated outside Upper Egypt. For example, archaeologists have identified small objects made from obsidian, a volcanic glass used for making sharp cutting tools. Chemical analysis of this obsidian indicates that it likely came from sources located far to the northeast, possibly in regions accessible through trade routes connecting Egypt with parts of the Near East. Marine shells discovered in predynastic graves provide another example of imported materials. These shells likely came from coastal environments along the Mediterranean or the Red Sea. Their presence in inland settlements suggests that exchange networks extended across considerable distances, linking Nile communities with coastal populations and desert travelers. Such trade networks were probably not organized in the formal manner seen in later civilizations. Instead, exchange may have taken place through a series of indirect contacts, with goods moving gradually from one community to another. Traders, travelers, or pastoral groups moving across desert routes could have served as intermediaries, carrying materials between distant regions. Control over valuable goods may have played an important role in shaping social dynamics within Naqada I communities. Individuals or families who had access to rare materials, such as obsidian tools, exotic shells, or copper objects, would likely have enjoyed greater prestige. Possessing such items could signal wealth, influence, or connections with distant trading partners. Archaeologists often observe that graves containing imported goods tend to include other valuable items as well, such as finely made pottery or carved stone vessels. This pattern suggests that certain individuals were accumulating multiple forms of wealth and status. Over time, such disparities may have contributed to the formation of early social hierarchies within these communities. Leadership roles may have begun to emerge partly through the management of trade relationships. Individuals who organized exchanges with neighboring groups or controlled access to valuable materials could strengthen their authority within the community. Their ability to distribute rare goods may have reinforced loyalty among followers or enhanced their prestige during communal ceremonies. Settlement patterns during the Naqada I period also reflect these changes. Some communities appear to have grown larger and more influential than others, possibly due to their strategic locations along trade routes or fertile agricultural areas. Sites such as Hierakonpolis and Naqada have produced evidence of extensive craft activity and large cemeteries, suggesting that they may have functioned as regional centers of economic and social influence. The growing complexity of craft production and trade had lasting consequences for the development of Egyptian society. Specialized artisans contributed to technological innovation and artistic refinement, while expanding trade networks connected communities across vast distances. These interactions allowed new ideas, materials, and cultural practices to circulate widely throughout the Nile Valley. At the same time, access to valuable resources began to shape social relationships in increasingly visible ways. Wealth and prestige became associated with the possession of rare materials and finely crafted objects. As these patterns intensified, certain individuals and communities gained advantages that would eventually lead to the emergence of more centralized forms of authority. With expanding trade and wealth, certain communities began to dominate their surrounding regions. By the mid-4th millennium BCE, the cultural traditions of Upper Egypt were spreading rapidly across the Nile Valley. What had begun as a regional cultural system during the earlier Naqada I period gradually expanded into a much broader network of shared artistic styles, technologies, and social practices. Archaeologists refer to this stage as the Naqada II or Gurzian phase, a period lasting roughly from 3500 to 3200 BCE. During these centuries, the influence of Upper Egyptian communities extended northward into the Nile Delta, transforming the cultural landscape of the entire valley. The Naqada II period takes its alternative name, Gurzian, from the archaeological site of Gurza, where distinctive pottery and burial objects characteristic of this phase were first identified. However, the cultural heartland of this tradition remained in Upper Egypt, particularly at major settlements such as Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos. Excavations at these sites have revealed evidence of growing populations, expanding craft production, and increasingly complex social organization. One of the clearest signs of cultural expansion during the Naqada II period is the spread of pottery styles associated with Upper Egypt. Ceramic vessels from this era display new decorative techniques and imagery that differ significantly from earlier traditions. Instead of the simple black-topped designs characteristic of Naqada I pottery, many Naqada II vessels feature painted scenes created with dark pigments on a lighter clay surface. These painted ceramics often depict a range of subjects, including animals, desert landscapes, and boats traveling along the Nile. Some vessels show stylized human figures engaged in activities that may represent ritual or ceremonial events. The appearance of such imagery suggests that pottery was increasingly used not only for practical purposes but also as a medium for symbolic or artistic expression. Boat imagery appears particularly frequently in Naqada II art. Long vessels with multiple oars and raised prows are often shown moving across stylized water lines. These images may represent real river travel along the Nile, but many scholars believe they also held symbolic significance. Boats were central to Egyptian life, enabling trade, communication, and travel between distant communities. Over time, they would also become important elements in religious symbolism, associated with journeys through the afterlife. Another important artistic development of the Naqada II period is the production of ceremonial palettes. These objects were typically carved from stone and shaped into distinctive forms, sometimes resembling animals or geometric figures. Originally, palettes were used for grinding mineral pigments that could be applied as cosmetics or body paint. However, during the Naqada II period, some palettes became highly decorative objects featuring carved relief scenes. These carvings often depict animals arranged in stylized patterns or engaged in dramatic confrontations. The imagery may have carried symbolic meanings related to power, order, and the natural world. In some cases, the scenes appear to represent themes of domination or control, ideas that would later become central to Egyptian royal iconography. Archaeologists studying settlement patterns during this period have also observed significant changes in the size and organization of communities. Villages that had once consisted of scattered dwellings gradually expanded into larger settlements with more structured layouts. Evidence from sites such as Hierakonpolis suggests that certain areas within settlements may have been dedicated to specific activities, including craft production and food storage. Excavations have uncovered specialized workshops where artisans produced stone vessels, pottery, and decorative objects. The concentration of tools and unfinished materials in these areas indicates that some individuals were dedicating much of their time to particular crafts rather than participating equally in farming or herding. This increasing specialization reflects the growing complexity of Naqada II society. At the same time, burial practices became more elaborate and differentiated. Cemeteries associated with major settlements contain a wide range of graves, from simple pits with minimal offerings to more elaborate burials containing numerous goods. These grave goods often include decorated pottery, carved stone vessels, jewelry, and imported materials obtained through trade. The presence of such objects in certain graves suggests that social inequality was becoming more pronounced. Individuals buried with larger numbers of valuable items likely held positions of influence within their communities. These may have included local leaders, wealthy families, or individuals associated with important religious or ceremonial roles. The geographic spread of Naqada II cultural practices is particularly striking. Artifacts displaying the characteristic pottery styles and artistic motifs of Upper Egypt have been discovered in numerous sites throughout the Nile Delta. This distribution suggests that communities in Lower Egypt were increasingly adopting the cultural traditions of the South. Scholars debate the precise mechanisms behind this expansion. Some researchers propose that trade and cultural exchange gradually introduced Upper Egyptian styles to northern populations. Others argue that the spread may reflect the growing political influence of powerful southern communities that established dominance over surrounding regions. Whatever the mechanism, the result was a gradual process of cultural integration across the Nile Valley. Shared artistic motifs, burial customs, and craft traditions began appearing across a wide geographic area, linking communities that had previously maintained more distinct regional identities. This cultural diffusion likely had important political implications. As traditions spread and interactions between settlements increased, competition for influence and resources may have intensified. Communities that controlled strategic locations along trade routes or fertile agricultural zones would have possessed significant advantages over their neighbors. Evidence from large settlement sites suggests that certain centers were becoming particularly prominent during the Naqada II period. These locations may have functioned as regional hubs where trade goods were exchanged, crafts were produced, and local leaders coordinated communal activities. Over time, such centers could accumulate economic and political power, attracting population growth and increasing their influence over surrounding villages. The expansion of Naqada culture therefore represents more than simply a change in artistic style or pottery design. It reflects a broader transformation in the social and political organization of the Nile Valley. Communities were becoming more interconnected, more specialized, and more hierarchical. These developments laid the groundwork for the emergence of larger political entities that would eventually compete for control over the entire region. As these processes unfolded, a number of powerful settlements began to dominate the surrounding landscape, establishing the foundations of early Egyptian state formation. This cultural expansion coincided with the rise of powerful regional centers. Some settlements along the Nile were beginning to grow into early political capitals. During the Naqada II period, several communities expanded far beyond the size and complexity of earlier village societies. These settlements developed features that archaeologists often associate with the earliest stages of urbanization: specialized production areas, ceremonial architecture, administrative activity, and large population concentrations. While they were not yet cities in the later historical sense, these proto-urban centers played a crucial role in the political transformation of Predynastic Egypt. Among the most prominent of these emerging centers were Hierakonpolis, Naqada, and Abydos. Each of these locations occupied strategic positions along the Nile and appears to have exercised influence over surrounding agricultural communities. Excavations at these sites reveal evidence of expanding settlements, specialized crafts, and organized ceremonial activities that suggest increasingly centralized leadership. One of the most extensively studied of these centers is Hierakonpolis, located on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt. Archaeological excavations at this site have revealed a settlement that covered a large area and contained distinct zones dedicated to different functions. Residential districts housed the general population, while other areas appear to have been reserved for craft production and ceremonial activities. Evidence for specialized workshops has been uncovered at several locations within the settlement. Archaeologists have identified concentrations of tools, raw materials, and partially finished artifacts indicating that artisans worked there on a regular basis. Stone vessel production, pottery manufacturing, and the carving of decorative objects all appear to have been carried out in designated areas. This level of craft specialization suggests that the community supported skilled workers whose primary role was the production of goods rather than agriculture. Hierakonpolis is also famous for evidence of large-scale feasting events. Excavations have revealed deposits containing large quantities of animal bones, pottery fragments, and other materials associated with communal gatherings. These remains indicate that large numbers of people may have gathered periodically for ceremonial meals or ritual celebrations. Such events likely played an important role in reinforcing social bonds and displaying the wealth and authority of local leaders. One of the most remarkable discoveries at Hierakonpolis is a large ceremonial structure sometimes referred to as a ritual enclosure. This building, constructed with substantial wooden posts and mud brick walls, appears to have served as a focal point for religious or political activities. The scale of the construction suggests that significant labor was organized to build and maintain the structure, implying the presence of leadership capable of coordinating large communal projects. Archaeologists interpret these ceremonial spaces as early expressions of institutional authority. Leaders who organized rituals or festivals may have used such events to strengthen their political influence, demonstrating their ability to mobilize resources and command respect within the community. The site of Naqada provides another example of a settlement that grew into a regional center during this period. Cemeteries associated with Naqada contain numerous graves filled with a variety of artifacts, including decorated pottery, carved stone vessels, and imported materials obtained through trade. The diversity and quality of these goods suggest that the settlement was a major hub within the Predynastic economic network. Evidence from the surrounding region indicates that smaller villages may have depended on larger centers like Naqada for trade and political coordination. Farmers living in nearby communities likely supplied agricultural products to these centers, while artisans and traders redistributed crafted goods and imported materials throughout the region. Further south along the Nile lies Abydos, another important settlement that would later become one of the most significant religious centers of ancient Egypt. During the Naqada II period, Abydos already displayed signs of growing importance. Excavations in nearby cemeteries have uncovered large tombs containing rich grave goods, suggesting that powerful local elites resided in the area. These burials differ from earlier graves not only in the quantity of objects they contain but also in the care with which they were constructed. Some tombs were lined with mud brick or divided into multiple chambers, indicating an increasing investment in funerary architecture. Such developments reflect the growing prestige associated with elite individuals and their families. The rise of proto-urban centers during the Naqada II period likely transformed the political landscape of Upper Egypt. As populations concentrated in larger settlements, leaders gained access to greater resources, including labor, agricultural production, and trade goods. These advantages allowed certain communities to extend their influence over surrounding territories. Control over agricultural land was particularly important. The fertile floodplain of the Nile provided the foundation of economic prosperity, and settlements that managed large areas of farmland could accumulate substantial food surpluses. These surpluses supported artisans, traders, and administrators who did not participate directly in farming but contributed to the functioning of the growing settlement. Trade networks also strengthened the position of proto-urban centers. Communities located at strategic points along the river or near desert routes could regulate the movement of valuable goods such as copper, stone, and decorative materials. By controlling access to these resources, local leaders could enhance their authority and attract followers seeking economic opportunities. Religious practices may have further reinforced the power of emerging elites. Ceremonial buildings and ritual gatherings created opportunities for leaders to demonstrate their role as intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds. Through festivals, offerings, and public rituals, they could legitimize their authority while strengthening the cultural unity of their communities. Over time, the influence of these centers likely extended beyond their immediate surroundings. Smaller villages may have recognized the authority of powerful settlements in exchange for protection, trade opportunities, or participation in regional religious traditions. In this way, proto-urban centers gradually formed networks of influence that foreshadowed later political states. The emergence of these large settlements therefore represents a critical stage in the development of Egyptian civilization. They illustrate how agricultural villages evolved into complex communities capable of organizing labor, managing trade, and conducting large-scale ceremonial activities. As regional centers expanded, competition for influence intensified. For the communities of Predynastic Egypt, the Nile was not simply a source of water, it was the main highway of economic exchange. Flowing through the otherwise harsh desert landscapes of northeastern Africa, the river created a natural corridor that linked distant settlements from Upper Egypt to the Mediterranean coast. During the late Predynastic period, particularly between 3500 and 3100 BCE, the Nile became the primary route for transporting goods, facilitating communication, and connecting communities across the valley. Unlike land travel across the surrounding deserts, which was slow and difficult, river travel offered a relatively efficient and predictable means of movement. The Nile flows northward, allowing boats to drift downstream with the current, while seasonal winds blowing from the Mediterranean made it possible to sail southward against the flow. This combination of current and wind created an unusually convenient transportation system that could be used throughout much of the year. Archaeological discoveries from settlements along the Nile provide clear evidence that river transport was widely used during the Predynastic period. Excavations at sites such as Hierakonpolis and Abydos have uncovered pottery, stone vessels, and other artifacts that originated far from the locations where they were found. These discoveries indicate that goods were regularly transported along the river between different regions of Egypt. One of the most important categories of traded goods was pottery. Ceramic vessels produced in particular regions often display distinctive shapes, colors, or decorative motifs. When archaeologists discover such pottery at distant sites, they can trace the movement of goods between communities. In many cases, pottery styles associated with Upper Egyptian settlements appear in locations hundreds of kilometers away, demonstrating the extent of river-based exchange networks. Stone vessels represent another example of materials transported through these networks. Producing such vessels required specialized knowledge and access to appropriate stone resources. As a result, certain communities became known for their expertise in stone carving. These artisans produced bowls, jars, and ceremonial containers that were then distributed along the Nile to other settlements. Bead production also became an important craft within the Predynastic economy. Artisans used materials such as stone, shell, and bone to produce decorative beads that could be worn as jewelry or sewn into garments. Because these items were relatively small and lightweight, they were easy to transport along the river and may have served as valuable trade goods exchanged between communities. The growing movement of goods along the Nile contributed to increasing economic specialization among settlements. Instead of each community producing all of its own tools and materials, certain villages or towns began focusing on particular crafts. For example, one settlement might develop a reputation for producing high-quality pottery, while another specialized in stone carving or bead making. This process of specialization encouraged interdependence between communities. Farmers, artisans, and traders all relied on access to goods produced elsewhere in the valley. As a result, economic relationships between settlements became more complex and organized over time. The development of river transport technologies played a crucial role in enabling these exchanges. Predynastic iconography frequently depicts boats traveling along the Nile. These images appear on pottery, carved palettes, and other artistic objects from the period. Many of these boats are shown with multiple oars and raised ends, suggesting that they were capable of carrying substantial cargo. Early vessels were likely constructed from bundles of papyrus reeds tied together to form lightweight boats suitable for travel along the river and through marshy areas. Over time, wooden plank boats began to appear, allowing for larger and more durable vessels capable of transporting heavier loads. The construction of such boats required coordinated labor and knowledge of woodworking techniques, indicating that boat building itself may have become a specialized craft. Certain locations along the Nile gradually emerged as important distribution hubs where goods could be exchanged and redistributed. Settlements positioned near fertile agricultural zones or at crossroads between river routes and desert paths held particular advantages. Communities living in these locations could collect agricultural surplus from surrounding farmland and distribute it to other settlements through trade. As these centers grew in importance, local leaders who controlled access to river traffic gained increasing influence. Managing docks, storage areas, or trading points would have allowed these elites to regulate the movement of goods and collect resources from traders passing through their territory. Over time, such economic control could translate into political power. Large settlements such as Naqada and Hierakonpolis likely benefited from their positions within these expanding networks. Archaeological evidence from these sites suggests that they received goods from multiple regions, including finely crafted pottery, exotic stones, and decorative materials. Their role as economic hubs helped strengthen their political influence within the surrounding landscape. The movement of goods along the Nile also facilitated the exchange of ideas and cultural practices. Traders and travelers carried not only physical objects but also new technologies, artistic styles, and social customs between communities. This constant interaction contributed to the spread of shared cultural traditions throughout the Nile Valley. For example, distinctive pottery styles and symbolic motifs began appearing across large geographic areas during the late Predynastic period. These similarities suggest that communities were not isolated but actively participating in networks of communication and cultural exchange. The Nile's role as a transportation corridor therefore had profound consequences for the development of early Egyptian society. By connecting distant settlements, the river allowed agricultural surpluses, crafted goods, and valuable materials to circulate widely throughout the region. This circulation supported growing populations, encouraged craft specialization, and strengthened relationships between communities. Perhaps most importantly, river transport helped create the economic foundations for political integration. Communities that once functioned independently were increasingly tied together through trade, shared technologies, and social interaction. While internal trade flourished along the Nile, contacts with regions beyond Egypt also began to expand. Beyond the fertile valley lay deserts rich with resources that early Egyptian communities sought to obtain. While the Nile River connected settlements within Egypt itself, predynastic societies also established important exchange relationships with regions outside the valley. To the south, the lands of Nubia offered valuable natural resources and access to distant trade networks. To the east, the rugged terrain of the eastern desert contained mineral deposits and routes leading toward the Red Sea coast. Together, these regions became crucial components of the expanding economic world of Predynastic Egypt. Trade between Upper Egypt and Nubia appears to have developed gradually over the course of the 4th millennium BCE. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities in both regions interacted through a combination of river travel and overland routes. Excavations at Predynastic Egyptian sites have uncovered numerous objects made from materials that originated far to the south. These items include ivory carvings, decorative ornaments, and other goods that could only have been obtained through contact with Nubian populations. Ivory was one of the most valued materials imported from Nubia. Elephant ivory provided artisans with a durable yet workable substance that could be carved into combs, figurines, decorative handles, and jewelry. Many of the finely carved ivory objects discovered in predynastic graves likely originated from elephant populations living in regions south of Egypt. Such items were often placed in high-status burials, suggesting that they were considered luxury goods associated with wealth and prestige. Gold may also have been obtained through contacts with Nubia. The region contained important gold-bearing deposits along the Nile and in nearby desert areas. Although large-scale gold mining is better documented in later Egyptian history, small quantities of gold appear in predynastic archaeological contexts. These early examples suggest that Egyptian communities were already aware of Nubia's mineral wealth and sought access to it through trade or expeditions. In addition to ivory and gold, Nubia provided other valuable materials, including animal skins, feathers, and exotic animal products. Such goods may have been used for decorative or ceremonial purposes within Egyptian communities. Their rarity would have enhanced their symbolic value, making them desirable items for elite display. The interaction between Egypt and Nubia was likely not limited to the exchange of goods alone. Cultural influences may have flowed in both directions as traders and travelers moved between the two regions. Archaeologists have identified similarities in pottery styles and burial customs that suggest periods of mutual contact and exchange. While Nubia provided resources from the south, the eastern desert offered another important source of valuable materials. Stretching between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, This mountainous desert region contains numerous mineral deposits. Among the most important of these were copper ores and semi-precious stones that could be used in tool-making and ornament production. Carnelian, a reddish-orange gemstone, was particularly prized in Predynastic Egypt. Artisans carved carnelian into beads and decorative elements that were worn as jewelry or placed in graves as burial goods. Because the stone does not occur naturally in the Nile Valley itself, it had to be obtained from desert regions where mineral deposits were accessible. Turquoise and other colorful minerals were also mined in areas east of the Nile. These materials added vibrant colors to jewelry and decorative objects, making them highly valued in pre-dynastic society. Access to such stones would have enhanced the prestige of individuals who possessed them. Obtaining these resources required travel across difficult terrain. The eastern desert is characterized by rugged mountains, dry valleys known as wadis, and extreme temperatures. Despite these challenges, archaeological evidence suggests that pre-dynastic Egyptians developed routes through this landscape that connected Nile settlements with mineral deposits and coastal areas. Some of these desert routes eventually led to trading points along the Red Sea coast, where additional resources and contacts with distant regions may have been possible. Although the full extent of these maritime connections during the pre-dynastic period remains uncertain, the existence of these routes demonstrates the growing mobility and organizational capacity of early Egyptian societies. Mining expeditions into the eastern desert may have required significant planning and coordination. Groups traveling into these remote areas would need supplies of water, food, and tools to extract minerals from rocky outcrops. Because such expeditions involved risk and considerable effort, they were likely organized or sponsored by local leaders who sought to secure valuable materials for their communities. Control over these distant resources could significantly enhance the power of emerging elites. Leaders who managed access to ivory, gold, copper, or precious stones would possess goods that could be distributed as gifts, used in rituals, or displayed as symbols of authority. In this way, long-distance trade contributed not only to economic growth but also to the development of social hierarchies. Settlements that served as gateways to these trade routes also gained strategic importance. Communities located near desert paths or river junctions could act as intermediaries between distant regions and the Nile Valley. By regulating the movement of goods through their territories, these settlements strengthened their economic influence and attracted population growth. The expansion of exchange networks with Nubia and the Eastern Desert therefore played a crucial role in shaping the political and economic development of pre-dynastic Egypt. Access to valuable materials encouraged exploration, trade, and the establishment of long-distance relationships that extended far beyond the Nile Valley. These growing economic networks extended even further, reaching regions across the Mediterranean and the Near East. At Abydos, the graves of powerful individuals reveal the earliest signs of royal authority in Egypt. During the late pre-dynastic period, particularly the Naqada III phase around 3200 to 3000 BCE, burial practices in Upper Egypt underwent a remarkable transformation. Tombs discovered in the cemeteries surrounding Abydos demonstrate increasing levels of complexity, scale, and wealth. These burials provide some of the clearest archaeological evidence for the emergence of elite leadership and the earliest forms of political authority in the Nile Valley. Abydos had already been an important settlement during earlier phases of the pre-dynastic period, but its role expanded significantly as regional political structures began to consolidate. Archaeologists have identified several cemetery areas near the site, including zones containing large tombs that differ dramatically from the simple burials typical of earlier centuries. These tombs were carefully constructed using mud brick walls and often contained multiple chambers arranged within rectangular structures. Unlike earlier graves, which typically consisted of a single pit containing a few pottery vessels and personal objects, elite tombs at Abydos were much more elaborate. Some included wooden roofing beams, internal partitions, and carefully prepared burial chambers designed to hold the body and numerous grave goods. The scale of these tombs suggests that considerable labor and planning were required for their construction. The ability to mobilize large numbers of workers to build such tombs indicates the presence of individuals who held substantial authority within their communities. Organizing the construction of a multi-chambered burial structure would have required coordination of materials, laborers, and skilled craftsmen. Such efforts imply that the individuals buried within these tombs possessed the power to command resources far beyond those available to ordinary members of society. The grave goods discovered within these elite burials further illustrate the wealth and status of their occupants. Archaeologists have uncovered finely carved stone vessels, decorative pottery, copper tools, and ceremonial palettes placed alongside the deceased. Many of these objects display exceptional craftsmanship and were likely produced by specialized artisans. Stone vessels are particularly common in these tombs. Made from materials such as alabaster, basalt, or diorite, these vessels required extensive labor to carve and polish. Their presence in elite graves suggests that they served as prestigious objects associated with wealth and social rank. Ceremonial palettes represent another category of significant artifacts found in these burials. These stone objects, originally used for grinding pigments, gradually evolved into symbolic items decorated with carved imagery. In elite tombs, palettes often appear as carefully crafted objects that may have held ritual or ceremonial importance. Copper tools discovered in Abydos burials provide additional evidence of technological advancement and economic power. Because copper ore was not readily available in the immediate Nile Valley, obtaining it required access to trade networks extending into desert mining regions. The presence of copper objects in elite graves therefore indicates that the individuals buried there had connections to broader economic systems. Imported luxury materials also appear among the grave goods at Abydos. Some tombs contain objects made from ivory, exotic stones, or decorative minerals that originated outside the local environment. These items demonstrate that long-distance trade networks were already supplying valuable goods to elite members of society. The placement of such objects within tombs reflects an important aspect of predynastic belief systems. Egyptians appear to have believed that the deceased required material goods in the afterlife. As a result, burial offerings were intended to provide the dead with the resources needed to continue their existence beyond death. For elite individuals, these offerings were particularly elaborate, reinforcing their prestige even in burial. Another notable feature of the Abydos cemeteries is the presence of subsidiary graves located around larger tomb structures. These smaller burials sometimes contain individuals who may have been servants, retainers, or members of the ruler's household. In some cases, archaeologists believe that these individuals were buried alongside the elite figure as part of a ritual practice associated with early royal authority. Although the exact interpretation of these subsidiary burials remains debated, their existence suggests that elite tombs functioned as focal points for complex funerary rituals. Such practices may have reinforced the social hierarchy of the community by emphasizing the special status of the ruler and their relationship to followers or attendants. The architectural organization of the cemeteries also reflects increasing political complexity. Elite tombs were often positioned prominently within burial grounds, surrounded by clusters of smaller graves. This spatial arrangement may have symbolized the central authority of the ruler within the social structure of the community. Scholars often interpret these elite burials as belonging to early regional rulers or proto-kings who governed territories along the Nile. These individuals likely exercised control over agricultural lands, trade routes, and craft production within their regions. Their wealth and power would have allowed them to command labor, organize large projects, and accumulate valuable goods. The emergence of such leaders represents an important step toward the formation of the Egyptian state. As regional rulers consolidated their authority, competition between powerful centers may have intensified. Some communities gained greater influence than others, gradually establishing dominance over neighboring territories. Abydos itself would later become one of the most significant royal burial sites in Egyptian history. During the early dynastic period, the earliest pharaohs were buried in monumental tombs in this same region, continuing a tradition that may have originated with the predynastic elites buried there. The tombs at Abydos therefore provide a crucial window into the moment when leadership structures in Egypt began to evolve from local authority into early forms of kingship. Through burial architecture, grave goods, and cemetery organization, archaeologists can trace the gradual rise of individuals whose power extended across increasingly large territories. Alongside monumental tombs, symbolic objects began to portray rulers exercising authority. power in predynastic Egypt was increasingly expressed through ritual and symbolic imagery. During the late Naqada III period, approximately 3200 to 3000 BCE, ceremonial objects began to depict figures adorned with distinctive crowns, headdresses, or other markers of authority. These artifacts, including carved palettes, decorated pottery, and ceremonial maceheads, provide some of the clearest evidence for the emergence of ritual kingship, an early form of political and religious authority that linked leadership to sacred legitimacy. One of the most prominent forms of symbolic representation is found on decorated palettes. These objects, often made from schist or other fine-grained stone, were initially functional tools for grinding pigments but evolved into elaborately carved ceremonial artifacts. Palettes from sites such as Hierakonpolis frequently depict central figures wearing tall crowns or distinctive headgear. These figures are shown holding objects that appear to be ritual staffs, scepters, or symbolic weapons, suggesting a dual role as both leaders and enforcers of social or religious order. Mace heads are another critical category of ceremonial objects associated with ritual kingship. These finely carved stone implements, often too delicate for practical combat use, depict scenes in which a central figure dominates or subdues enemies. Such imagery conveys authority and control, reinforcing the idea that the individual depicted wields power not only through material resources, but also through sanctioned social and ritual roles. Archaeologists interpret these objects as visual assertions of proto-royal authority, emphasizing the linkage between leadership, military capability, and divine sanction. Decorated pottery also contributes to our understanding of early sacred authority. Vessels often feature motifs that signify power, fertility, or the cyclical nature of the Nile. Some imagery portrays ceremonial activities, such as processions, ritual combats, or offerings, in which a central figure is clearly distinguished from others by scale, attire, or placement. These visual cues signal the elevated status of proto-kings and their role in structuring communal life. The adoption of crowns and headdresses as symbols of authority marks an important development in early Egyptian political culture. While crowns became fully standardized during the early dynastic period, the late predynastic examples suggest the initial stages of this symbolic system. Distinctive headgear served to identify leaders, signal rank, and legitimize claims to power. By incorporating these markers into ceremonial objects, communities visually reinforced the special status of rulers within both political and religious spheres. Many of these ritual depictions also highlight the integration of political and religious roles. Leaders are shown performing activities that appear simultaneously administrative, martial, and ceremonial. This dual authority indicates that early Egyptian rulers derived their power from both tangible control of resources and symbolic or spiritual legitimacy. Archaeologists and Egyptologists frequently describe this fusion as the foundation of early sacred kingship. The concept of divine or semi-divine legitimacy may also be inferred from associated iconography. In some depictions, rulers are positioned above or separated from common individuals, emphasizing hierarchical relationships. Animals, celestial symbols, or abstract motifs are occasionally included to suggest cosmic or supernatural sanction. Such imagery reinforces the idea that leadership was more than a matter of wealth or military strength. It was a recognized social and spiritual role within the community. Ritual ceremonies appear to have been central to reinforcing this authority. Archaeological evidence from proto-urban centers suggests that gatherings, whether for offerings, feasting, or symbolic displays, were organized under the oversight of elite leaders. These events allowed rulers to demonstrate their capacity to mobilize labor, control resources, and maintain social cohesion. Participation in ritual reinforced communal recognition of authority, ensuring that leaders' power was both visible and culturally sanctioned. The combination of symbolic objects, ceremonial practices, and visual representation helped to solidify the emerging ideology of kingship. By presenting themselves as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, proto-kings could claim legitimacy that transcended simple political control. Their authority was thus reinforced through a complex interplay of economic power, ritual performance, and visual symbolism. Control over ritual practices and sacred spaces may also have contributed to centralizing leadership. Communities that recognized a particular individual as the focal point of religious activity would have concentrated power in ways that extended beyond household or village leadership. This centralization provided a framework for organizing labor, managing resources, and coordinating activities across wider territories. Importantly, the development of ritual kingship during the predynastic period set the stage for more formal administrative systems. As leaders assumed sacred authority, they required mechanisms to govern economic production, coordinate large-scale projects, and maintain order. The ideological foundation established by ceremonial objects and ritual imagery would later support the bureaucratic structures of the early dynastic state. By linking political power to religious legitimacy, predynastic leaders effectively transformed elite authority into a form of sacred rulership. These early rulers could assert dominance not only through control of land, labor, or goods, but also through symbolic and ritual influence recognized across multiple communities. As royal ideology developed, administrative systems began to emerge to support centralized leadership. By the late predynastic period, competition between Nile Valley communities was increasingly resolved through organized violence. Archaeological findings indicate that as settlements expanded and regional centers gained influence, disputes over fertile agricultural land, control of trade routes, and access to valuable resources often escalated into armed conflict. Warfare appears to have been a significant factor shaping the political landscape of Upper Egypt during the Naqada III phase, roughly 3200 to 3000 BCE. Excavations at Hierakonpolis and Abydos provide some of the clearest evidence for this development. Skeletal remains recovered from cemeteries at these sites display injuries consistent with violent encounters. Fractures, embedded projectile points, and other trauma patterns suggest that individuals were involved in physical confrontations, possibly including both individual combat and organized group engagements. The prevalence of such injuries in multiple sites indicates that conflict was not isolated but a recurring aspect of predynastic life. Material culture further reinforces the presence of warfare in these communities. Stone palettes, ceremonial ivory carvings, and decorated pottery frequently depict scenes of violence and subjugation. Figures are shown wielding weapons such as maces, spears, and clubs, while others appear bound as captives. Some palettes depict coordinated assaults on rival settlements or groups, suggesting that collective action and tactical organization were increasingly employed during confrontations. These images demonstrate that violent competition was not merely opportunistic but involved deliberate planning and symbolic display of dominance. Ceremonial mace heads in particular illustrate the interplay between military power and social authority. These objects, often elaborately carved, show central figures triumphing over enemies or asserting control over subjugated individuals. Scholars interpret these depictions as reinforcing the legitimacy of emerging leaders, emphasizing their ability to protect and expand territory while consolidating political power. In addition to iconographic evidence, archaeological surveys of settlement layouts suggest adaptations related to conflict. Some sites display strategic positioning on elevated terrain, natural defensive barriers, or proximity to the Nile to facilitate transport and reinforcement. Although walls and fortifications are rare in early predynastic settlements, later Naqada III sites show increasingly deliberate construction of protective features, such as embankments or palisades, to safeguard inhabitants and resources. The growth of specialized crafts and trade networks also created incentives for armed competition. Control over access to rare materials, such as copper from the eastern desert, exotic stones from Nubia, and fine-quality clay for ceramics, could enhance a settlement's wealth and influence. Communities with the capacity to protect these assets through force had advantages in regional power dynamics, which likely contributed to the emergence of proto-kings and centralized authority. Resource scarcity in certain regions may have amplified conflict. The Nile floodplain, while fertile, is limited in width, and access to the most productive agricultural land was a valuable asset. Competition over these lands, combined with demographic growth and increasing settlement density, created pressures that occasionally erupted into violent confrontation. Evidence of warfare is also present in burial practices. Some elite graves contain weapons, suggesting that military prowess was a valued attribute for leaders. Placement of maces, daggers, or projectile points alongside the deceased indicates recognition of the role of martial skill in maintaining authority and social standing. Such associations imply that leadership increasingly required both political acumen and the ability to organize or command armed groups. The archaeological record further shows that early violence was not always lethal or large-scale. Some depictions and injuries suggest ritualized conflict or demonstrations of force intended to intimidate rivals rather than cause extensive casualties. Nevertheless, these encounters contributed to the broader process of state formation by reinforcing hierarchical structures and demonstrating the power of emerging elites. Trade routes, particularly along the Nile, became both assets and targets in this environment. Settlements controlling river traffic could regulate the movement of goods, levy tributes, and protect valuable commodities. Consequently, the ability to defend these routes through armed force became an essential aspect of political authority. In summary, by the late Predynastic period, warfare had become a key element in the evolution of regional power. The combination of skeletal trauma, iconography, settlement patterns, and burial evidence demonstrates that organized violence was integral to social and political competition. Leaders who could mobilize armed groups, protect resources, and display military prowess strengthened their positions, paving the way for more centralized authority. As conflict became more common, communities began developing physical defenses to protect their settlements in response to growing political competition. Some settlements began to transform themselves into fortified communities. By the late Predynastic period, the increasing frequency of armed conflicts and competition for fertile land and trade access prompted certain Nile Valley communities to adopt defensive measures. Archaeological excavations at Upper Egyptian sites, including Hierakonpolis and Naqada, reveal evidence of perimeter walls, ditches, and strategically positioned structures, demonstrating that settlements were actively designed to resist external threats. Fortifications varied in scale and complexity depending on the size and wealth of the community. At some sites, thick mud brick walls surrounded central areas, creating a barrier between residents and potential aggressors. In other settlements, defensive ditches were dug around key sections, sometimes accompanied by raised embankments that offered additional protection. These measures indicate an awareness of potential attacks and a deliberate effort to safeguard both inhabitants and valuable resources. Settlement layouts were also adapted to enhance defensibility. Houses, storage facilities, and communal spaces were often arranged in patterns that restricted access to central areas. Narrow corridors, controlled entry points, and clustered housing could slow or channel potential attackers, allowing defenders to better monitor movement within the settlement. Such spatial organization suggests that even the arrangement of domestic structures was influenced by security considerations. Archaeological evidence further shows that inhabitants were equipped to respond to threats. Stone maceheads, flint blades, and early copper tools appear frequently in both graves and habitation layers, signaling that residents were prepared for armed confrontation. These weapons were both functional and symbolic. They could serve in defense while also signaling the community's capacity for organized resistance to rivals. Ceremonial or display items, such as decorated palettes and ivory carvings depicting warriors and captives, may also have reinforced the community's awareness of martial authority. By combining practical defenses with symbolic imagery, settlements projected power and deterrence to neighboring groups, potentially reducing the likelihood of direct confrontation. In addition to physical fortifications, strategic site selection played an important role in defense. Many settlements were situated on elevated terrain, along river bends, or near natural barriers that restricted access. These geographic advantages improved visibility, allowed for early detection of approaching threats, and complicated attacks from hostile groups. Positioning near the Nile also enabled rapid transport of resources and personnel via river, supporting both economic and military resilience. Evidence of fortifications and defensive planning is not uniform across all predynastic sites, suggesting that the level of militarization corresponded with local conditions. Smaller, isolated villages may have relied primarily on natural barriers or community vigilance, while larger proto-urban centers invested in substantial construction projects to protect economic and political assets. The scale of investment in fortifications likely reflects the relative importance of the settlement within regional networks and its access to resources. Weapons found within these fortified sites provide further insight into defensive strategies. Stone maces and clubs could be used to repel attackers at close range, while flint blades and projectile points allowed for range defense. Early copper tools, though relatively rare, represent the beginning of metallurgical experimentation and may have given certain communities technological advantages in combat. The presence of these implements within both domestic and ceremonial contexts underscores the integration of martial readiness into everyday life. The development of fortified settlements also had broader social implications. Organizing labor to construct walls, ditches, and defensive structures required coordination and leadership, providing early rulers with opportunities to consolidate authority. Leaders who successfully mobilized workforces for defense projects could enhance their prestige, strengthen control over resources, and demonstrate their capacity to protect the community. In this way, defensive architecture reinforced both the material and symbolic power of emerging elites. Additionally, fortifications served as focal points for surrounding agricultural lands. By securing the central settlement, leaders ensured the protection of fields, granaries, and trade goods. The ability to defend resources directly contributed to economic stability, supporting population growth and allowing craft specialization and trade to continue even in times of regional instability. Archaeological surveys suggest that these defensive developments were part of a broader pattern of militarization in Upper Egypt. Communities with strategic locations, access to trade networks, or control over fertile land increasingly invested in protective measures, indicating that warfare had become a regular aspect of life in certain regions of the Nile Valley. While many settlements struggled to maintain security, a few powerful centers began to dominate the political landscape. The combination of fortified sites, armed inhabitants, and strategic site selection allowed proto-urban communities to assert influence over neighboring villages. Leaders who controlled these centers gained advantages not only in warfare but also in trade, resource distribution, and ritual authority, setting the stage for the consolidation of political power that would culminate in the early dynastic state. These fortified settlements illustrate how predynastic Egyptians adapted to an environment of increasing competition. By combining architecture, site planning, and martial readiness, communities created resilient centers capable of withstanding threats while asserting regional dominance. As these defensive and organizational strategies developed, the most powerful centers began to consolidate influence, paving the way for centralized leadership and the emergence of early dynastic authority. Predynastic artists began portraying leaders in ways that emphasized their authority over rivals. By the late Naqada III period, approximately 3200 to 3000 BCE, emerging elites increasingly employed visual symbolism to communicate and legitimize political power. Artistic depictions from sites such as Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Naqada demonstrate a deliberate focus on rulers in ceremonial, martial, and ritual contexts. These images are preserved on carved stone palettes, decorated pottery, and ceremonial maceheads, providing tangible evidence of early forms of royal ideology. One prominent motif depicts a central figure seizing an enemy by the hair while raising a weapon, often a mace or club, in a gesture of domination. This imagery, repeated across multiple ceremonial objects, communicates authority, victory, and control over both rivals and territory. Archaeologists interpret these scenes as the visual codification of leadership, signaling the emergence of proto-royal status within regional centers. Crowns and headdresses became distinguishing elements of these depictions. Different types of crowns may have signified territorial authority, religious role, or hierarchical rank. For example, early illustrations show tall conical or white crowns that later correspond to Upper Egypt's traditional headdress, while other headgear may indicate sacred office. The consistent representation of such symbols suggests that leadership was moving beyond individual prominence toward recognizable, institutionalized authority. Ceremonial weapons further reinforced the notion of power. Maces, scepters, and staffs appear not only in combat scenes but also in ritual contexts, indicating that rulers wielded influence both militarily and symbolically. The combination of weaponry and ritual objects communicates that early leaders derived legitimacy from both control over resources and performance of sacred or socially sanctioned acts. Decorated palettes also contribute to the development of royal iconography. Initially functional objects for grinding pigments, these stone artifacts evolved into ceremonial items that conveyed political messages. Some palettes feature composite scenes in which a ruler dominates enemies, oversees subordinates, and engages in ritual activities. The careful carving of figures, hierarchical scale, and placement of objects within these compositions indicate intentional visual strategies to communicate authority. Early use of symbolic regalia extended to garments, jewelry, and body adornments. Individuals depicted in these roles are often distinguished by distinctive collars, belts, or ornamentation, signaling status and differentiating leaders from ordinary community members. The accumulation of symbolic markers helped standardize visual representations of authority, creating a shared cultural language for recognizing power. These artistic conventions suggest that political authority was becoming institutionalized rather than purely personal. Leaders were no longer solely defined by their individual capacity for wealth, charisma, or martial skill. Instead, their status was reinforced through recognizable symbols, ceremonial objects, and ritualized actions. This standardization facilitated communication of authority across settlements and regions, allowing emerging rulers to assert legitimacy over broader territories. Archaeological context supports this interpretation. Many of the palettes, maceheads, and pottery fragments bearing royal imagery were found in elite tombs or ceremonial spaces, highlighting their association with high-status individuals. The placement of these objects in ritual or funerary contexts reinforced the idea that leadership was both socially and spiritually sanctioned. Symbolic imagery thus became intertwined with broader cultural practices that acknowledged and perpetuated elite authority. The repeated use of particular motifs indicates shared conventions across Upper Egypt during the Predynastic period. Sites such as Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Naqada show similar visual strategies, suggesting that regional elites were not acting in isolation. Rather, a network of communities participated in the development and dissemination of early royal iconography, creating a coherent visual language that transcended local settlements. This symbolic framework laid the foundation for dynastic Egyptian art and political representation. Many motifs that appear in the Naqada III period, such as the ruler overpowering an enemy, the use of crowns, and ritualized gestures of authority, continued into the early dynastic period, becoming central elements of Egyptian royal imagery for centuries. By establishing visual conventions that linked power with ritual, territory, and personal achievement, predynastic elites were effectively codifying the concept of kingship. Alongside these images, ceremonial objects played an important role in expressing political power. Items such as maceheads, palettes, and finely crafted vessels were not merely decorative. They served as tangible markers of authority and were often used in public or ritual settings to reinforce the status of the individual who wielded or owned them. In combination with iconography, these artifacts created a multi-layered system of visual and material legitimacy, signaling the emergence of centralized leadership and early kingship in Egypt. Political authority in predynastic Egypt was increasingly expressed through ritual performance. By the late Naqada III period, emerging leaders relied not only on material resources and military power, but also on ceremonial practices that reinforced their status and social legitimacy. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Naqada have uncovered a range of ceremonial artifacts, including stone palettes, maceheads, and decorated vessels, which provide tangible evidence of the role of ritual in political life. Stone palettes, initially functional tools for grinding pigments, evolved into objects of ceremonial significance. Many display complex carved scenes featuring central figures, often depicted as rulers, engaged in symbolic activities such as subduing enemies, overseeing followers, or performing ritual gestures. The careful detailing of animals, iconographic motifs, and hierarchical arrangements conveys authority, suggesting that these objects were intended to communicate both political and spiritual legitimacy. Archaeologists interpret these palettes as instruments used in public or ritualized contexts to affirm the status of leaders within the community. Maceheads, another prominent category of ceremonial objects, frequently exhibit elaborately carved scenes illustrating martial and ritual symbolism. Some depict a ruler triumphing over adversaries, controlling livestock, or performing sacred ceremonies. These items were likely used in ritual contexts to signify the ruler's ability to protect and govern their territory. The repeated use of standardized motifs across multiple sites suggests that such objects played a recognized role in establishing the authority of early elites, linking leadership with both societal order and symbolic power. Decorated vessels provide additional evidence of ritualized political practice. Ceramics and stone containers often carry motifs associated with leadership, fertility, or cosmic order. These artifacts may have been employed in feasting, offerings, or public ceremonies, where their presence underscored the connection between rulers and the wider social or religious framework. The production of such objects required skilled craftsmanship, indicating that elite patrons could mobilize specialized artisans to create items that visually reinforced their status. Public rituals involving these ceremonial objects likely played a central role in maintaining social cohesion. Gatherings centered around ritual display allowed leaders to demonstrate control over resources, orchestrate symbolic performances, and communicate hierarchical structures. By participating in these ceremonies, communities acknowledged the authority of proto-kings, reinforcing their legitimacy through shared cultural practice. Archaeological evidence from proto-urban centers supports the interpretation that such ritual activity was integral to emerging political systems. Symbolism embedded in ceremonial objects also conveyed ideological messages. Scenes of rulers subjugating enemies or controlling animals can be interpreted as metaphors for maintaining order within society and the natural world. By linking political authority to cosmic or divine forces, these artifacts helped transform local elites into figures whose power was socially and spiritually sanctioned. Such practices contributed to the standardization of rulership concepts, laying the groundwork for the institutionalized kingship of the early dynastic period. The presence of luxury materials within these objects further emphasized their role in asserting authority. Stone, ivory, and rare minerals used in palettes, maceheads, and vessels highlight the capacity of elite patrons to acquire and control resources, demonstrating both wealth and access to long-distance trade networks. This material investment reinforced the social and political significance of ceremonial performance, as the objects themselves became symbols of power and control. These artifacts also reflect increasing regional interaction. Similar motifs and ceremonial forms appear across Upper Egyptian settlements, including Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Naqada, indicating that elite practices were not isolated but part of a shared cultural vocabulary. The dissemination of these objects and associated rituals contributed to the emergence of a coherent visual and ceremonial language for leadership, facilitating recognition of authority across multiple communities. In addition, ceremonial practices provided early rulers with opportunities to organize and mobilize labor. The production, transport, and display of large or elaborately carved objects required coordinated effort, enhancing the political influence of leaders who could direct such activities. Ritualized use of these objects therefore reinforced both practical authority and symbolic legitimacy. By the end of the Predynastic period, ceremonial objects had become central to the performance of political power. They communicated hierarchy, displayed control over resources, and linked leaders to religious or cosmic legitimacy. This system of ritualized authority helped stabilize emerging social structures, allowing early elites to consolidate influence over increasingly complex settlements. As royal symbolism expanded, new titles and administrative roles began to appear, supporting the growing institutional framework of early Egyptian kingship. The patchwork of competing communities in Upper Egypt was gradually transforming into a unified political system. By the late 4th millennium BCE, evidence from archaeological excavations indicates that a small number of powerful rulers exercised authority over extensive stretches of the Nile Valley. Elite tombs at Abydos and surrounding sites contain large burial structures, multiple chambers, and rich grave goods, signaling control over substantial labor forces and access to valuable resources. These tombs suggest that leadership was increasingly centralized, with a small cadre of elites exercising influence over multiple settlements. The process of political integration appears to have been gradual and multifaceted. Alliances, often cemented through marriage or economic cooperation, played an important role in consolidating power. Control of trade routes and access to essential resources, including fertile agricultural land and long-distance goods such as copper, carnelian, and ivory, enabled emerging rulers to dominate neighboring communities economically. Archaeological evidence of standardized material culture, such as consistent pottery styles, iconography, and ceremonial objects, indicates shared cultural practices that facilitated political cohesion across regions. Military activity also contributed to the consolidation of authority. Evidence from skeletal trauma and iconographic depictions of conflict suggests that disputes between rival communities were sometimes resolved through force. Leaders capable of organizing and directing armed groups could assert dominance over contested territories, thereby reinforcing their position within the emerging hierarchy. Strategic sites along the Nile, including fortified settlements and proto-urban centers, served as bases from which rulers could project power and maintain control over surrounding lands. Economic integration was closely tied to political authority. Dominant leaders regulated agricultural production, controlled access to irrigation infrastructure, and supervised craft specialization within key settlements. For example, evidence from Hierakonpolis and Naqada shows that workshops producing pottery, stone vessels, and ceremonial objects operated under elite oversight. By coordinating production and distribution, rulers could centralize wealth and ensure loyalty from subordinate communities, further strengthening political cohesion. The spatial distribution of elite tombs reflects territorial control. Larger, more elaborate tombs are concentrated near central settlements, suggesting that powerful rulers established core domains from which influence radiated outward. Smaller settlements appear to have maintained a degree of autonomy but likely operated under the political or economic influence of these dominant centers. This hierarchical structure laid the groundwork for administrative systems capable of managing increasingly complex territories. Ceremonial and symbolic practices reinforced integration. Rituals, feasting events, and the distribution of luxury goods allowed elites to demonstrate authority while creating shared cultural norms across communities. By participating in or observing these activities, subordinate groups acknowledged the legitimacy of dominant rulers, solidifying their political role. Iconography depicting rulers performing both martial and sacred functions also communicated authority across the landscape, linking social, military, and religious power. The consolidation of Upper Egypt illustrates the interplay between geography, economy, and leadership. The Nile's predictable flood cycles supported intensive agriculture, enabling population growth and surplus production. Settlements that could organize labor effectively and secure these resources were able to expand influence, attract artisans, and dominate trade networks. In this environment, political integration was both a response to resource competition and a strategy for maintaining stability across increasingly complex societies. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, Upper Egypt exhibited a high degree of political centralization. While not yet fully unified under a single ruler, the majority of settlements recognized the authority of a few dominant leaders, establishing a pattern of governance that combined economic control, military capability, and ritual legitimacy. This integration created the necessary conditions for eventual unification with Lower Egypt, providing a framework for the emergence of the early dynastic state. With Upper Egypt largely unified, attention increasingly turned toward the Nile Delta. Contacts between southern centers and northern communities intensified, laying the foundation for political and cultural integration across the entire Nile Valley. After centuries of gradual development, the Nile Valley finally came under a single ruler. Around 3100 BCE, the process of political consolidation that had begun in Upper Egypt reached its culmination with the emergence of a centralized authority extending from the First Cataract in the south to the Nile Delta in the north. Archaeological evidence points to a figure traditionally identified as Narmer, whose activities symbolize the formal unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis, provides one of the most compelling visual records of this process. The Narmer palette depicts a central figure wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, signifying dual authority over the two regions. Hieroglyphic and iconographic elements illustrate scenes of subjugated enemies, processions, and ritual acts, linking military conquest with ceremonial legitimacy. Scholars debate whether the palette represents a specific historical event, such as a campaign by Narmer to assert control over the delta, or whether it is a symbolic representation of the broader political integration that unfolded over several generations. Regardless, the artifact confirms the conceptual emergence of a unified monarchy and the codification of kingship symbols that would persist into the dynastic period. Other material evidence supports the establishment of centralized authority. Fortified administrative centers, large-scale elite tombs, and standardization of artifacts across Upper and Lower Egypt indicate that local rulers were subordinated to a dominant political hierarchy. The proliferation of similar iconography, ceremonial objects, and administrative techniques across the Nile Valley reflects the imposition of a common visual and institutional language, facilitating governance over the newly unified territory. Economic integration played a critical role in unification. Control of agricultural land, irrigation infrastructure, and trade networks allowed the emerging monarchy to redistribute resources, support specialized craftsmen, and fund monumental construction projects. Artifacts such as imported stone vessels, jewelry, and fine pottery illustrate the continuity of trade networks established during the pre-dynastic period, now operating under centralized oversight. The management of surplus production and taxation likely enabled the monarch to maintain authority over both rural and urban communities. Military capacity continued to underpin political control. Elite tombs and ceremonial objects emphasize martial prowess, illustrating the role of armed force in consolidating territories. Strategic settlements at key locations along the Nile, particularly at trade junctions and fertile regions, served as bases for projecting power and maintaining control. By organizing and deploying these resources effectively, the monarchy could deter rebellion and ensure the loyalty of subordinate centers. The unification of Egypt also involved religious and ideological consolidation. Ritual practices, including the use of ceremonial objects and public ceremonies, reinforced the sacral authority of the monarch. The association of kingship with divine legitimacy, already developing during the pre-dynastic period, became more formalized. Symbols such as the dual crowns, scepters, and depictions of the ruler overcoming enemies communicated that authority was both political and sacred, establishing a model for successive dynasties. Cultural integration accompanied political and economic consolidation. Pottery styles, artistic motifs, and ceremonial practices from Upper and Lower Egypt began to converge, reflecting the emergence of a shared visual and material culture. This cultural unification facilitated communication, governance, and identity formation across previously distinct regions, enabling the early monarchy to maintain cohesion over a diverse population. The unification of Egypt marked the transition from pre-dynastic experimentation with leadership, trade, and ritual to a fully realized dynastic state. Narmer's reign represents the institutionalization of kingship, codifying symbols, ceremonies, and administrative practices that would shape Egypt's political and cultural history for centuries. This process established the framework for subsequent rulers to govern a complex society with centralized authority, formalized bureaucracy, and integrated economic systems. By consolidating Upper and Lower Egypt, the early monarchy laid the foundation for monumental architecture, state-sponsored religious institutions, and long-distance trade on an unprecedented scale. The political, economic, and ritual innovations of the pre-dynastic period coalesced into a stable framework that would support the rise of the early dynastic and Old Kingdom states. The new monarchy required institutions capable of governing a vast territory. Centralized administration, standardized material culture, and a sacralized ideology of kingship became essential tools for sustaining authority, ensuring economic stability, and maintaining social order across the unified Nile Valley. These developments marked the definitive end of the pre-dynastic era and the beginning of Egypt's dynastic history. Before we continue exploring the incredible history of ancient Egypt, hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to get daily Nightfall history videos. Don't forget to comment with your favorite part of this journey through the pre-dynastic Nile Valley.